They died younger than any soldier, not by musket ball, but by rot, rats, and despair. Yet they return to this floating hell by choice. Discover why the promise of pirate freedom was the cruelest illusion of all. The dawn light crept onto the rolling waves, but there was nothing romantic about the life it revealed. On a ship's rotten deck, a young pirate named Elias clutched a splintered mast, his body racked with fever. In that moment, gasping between delirious coughs, he wished only for his mother's embrace, just as any soldier has cried out, clutching a jungle mud-caked uniform in Vietnam. Centuries separate them, yet the raw anguish is identical. Most of us picture pirates as swashbuckling rogues, living fast and flourishing in freedom. The truth? They died faster than any frontline soldier. The average life expectancy of a Golden Age pirate barely topped 30 years, shorter even than that of a private in the French and Indian War, whose greatest risk lay in musket fire rather than pestilence, malnutrition, and relentless seasickness. Imagine rotting flesh beneath your own feet. The water sloshing in the hold carried dysentery and cholera, inviting parasites to feast on your flesh at night. Smuggling rats and lice were your only companions. And when infection set in, there was no surgeon's tent, only a blunt knife and a prayer. One wrong cut, and gangrene would claim your limb, and then your life. When Captain Randall ordered the amputation of young Thomas's arm, the boy screamed not for mercy, but for his mother. His cries echoed off the timbers like a curse stitched into the ship's hull. And yet they chose this hell willingly. Why? Not for gold, nor for glory, but for a desperate sliver of autonomy that society denied them. Many were orphans, debtors, cast out by rigid hierarchies on land. On pirate ships, they tasted democracy, each vote a fleeting triumph, before betrayal delivered them to the gallows. This is no swashbuckling fairy tale. This is rot, deception, betrayal. This is sin and salvation mixed in brine and blood. But what drove them back, day after day, to storms that shattered bones and secrets darker than the ocean's depths? In today's world, we brand criminals others. But these men and women were our equals, drowning in the same misconceptions of freedom and dignity. Their story is not merely of cutlasses and cannon fire, but of universal human truths: fear of insignificance, yearning for belonging, and the enduring hope that even in the most hellish conditions, meaning can be found. By the time you realize the pirate's life you envy was a veneer too thin to save anyone, you'll understand the real treasure, the tragic, electrifying human spirit that refused to break, even when everything else did. This is their secret, and by the end, you'll never hear the word pirate the same way again. He'd been a farmer's son once, his hands soft and sun-browned from plowing fields, his stomach full of fresh bread and cheese. But when hunger stalked his village, when the landlord's taxes swallowed every barrel of grain, he ran to the sea, lured by the promise of plunder and pay. He traded his shoes for seaworthy boots, his knife for a pistol that hadn't been cleaned in months. The moment he set foot on the deck of the Scarlet Marauder, he felt the first betrayal of his own body. Within days, his muscles, accustomed to the even rhythm of the plow, ached with a new, unrelenting soreness. Every creak of the deck sent shudders through his spine. Every wave that slammed the ship's hull felt like a hammer cracking his bones. He discovered that bone-deep fatigue cannot be cured with sleep. In the forecastle, hammocks hung in tight rows, each a nest of sweat, vomit, and rat droppings. At night, The fabric pulsed under him, alive with fleas that sank their teeth into his skin. He'd scratch until his fingernails bled, but the bites only swelled and hardened into pustules. Morning brought no relief. The air smelled of mold, stale seawater, and unwashed bodies. He gagged when a wave spray mingled with the stench, coating his tongue with brine. Parched, he dipped a tin cup into the ship's barrel of fresh water. A murky brew of rain, runoff and sea spray, seeded with larvae that hatched into wriggling maggots where it pooled in his throat. He forced himself to drink, panic coursing through his belly as bits of decaying organic matter scraped his tongue. Within a week, cramps tore through his gut. His insides contorted, black bile splashing onto the deck in hot, acidic jets. Dysentery settled like a curse, and he learned to make the snap decision between puking over the bulkhead or emptying his bowels in his pants. Both actions scarred his memory, the sour tang of bile on his lips, the warm, runny weight in his breeches. Fellow sailors gave him wide berth, muttering prayers that his suffering might keep them safe from contagion. Food, when offered, was no salvation. Hardtack biscuits were pounded so thin they snapped like glass, then soaked in brackish water until they balanced between soggy and rancid. Salt pork, saved from the hold, bore the rancid odor of spoiled fat and tiny black spots, worm trails, tracing the meat's veins. To starve was agony, to eat was entombment alive. He watched his own hands tremble as he bit into the pork, feeling sinew tear in his jaw like tearing cloth. The heaviest punishment, though, was cold. The Atlantic winds cut through the ship's planking as though it were paper. His clothes were thin, patched, and never dry. Each night, his bones rattled in his chest, and he whispered prayers to keep his lungs from filling with fluid. Morning light found layers of crusted salt on his eyelashes, his hair matted with moisture. Hypothermia slithered around him, numbing his extremities until he could barely feel his own fingers. He'd try to warm them between his knees, but they stayed cold as marble. When he fell ill enough to be carried to the surgeon's bay, he discovered the truest horror of all. The Sawbones, a hulking man more brutal than an enemy boarding party, wielded a carpenter's saw to lop off infected limbs. No laudanum, no ether, only a swig of rum and a coarse burlap gag thrust into his mouth. He bit down. His teeth cracked under the strain. His screams ricocheted against the wooden bulkheads in a symphony of agony. He clenched his eyes shut. But behind his lids, he saw the saw's blade glittering, heard the crack as bone met metal. When it was done, the stump bled freely. The sawbones pressed gunpowder into the wound to staunch the flow, and the stain spread like a dark flower. Days later, he found fragments of bone in the rag stuffed in his socket. He tore the rag out and swallowed it in panic, only to retch bile again. The ship lurched beneath him, and he vomited until his throat was raw. His stump ached with phantom pain, ghostly throb that ached as if the limb still remained. Every time he leaned his weight on a gurning, patched knee, he felt the dull thud of absence. Teeth came next. The salt and sugar in their rations were a feast for decay. His molars loosened, the roots ravaged by infection. He tried to chew with his front teeth, but chunks of meat tore free from rotting sockets. He spit out globs of blood and tissue, tasting marrow and bile. On deck, gulls circled overhead, shrieking as if mocking his helplessness. At the bottom of the hold, darkness settled like a living thing. He lay on straw-stained black with old filth, listening to the scuttle of rats whose sinewy bodies slipped over his face. Their whiskers brushed his cheek. Their gnawing teeth scraped the wood above. He lashed out blindly in panic, his stump swinging uselessly, and struck a rat full in the flank. The creature screeched and darted away, but he knew there were dozens more waiting. He almost welcomed death when he heard the whisper from the gun deck. Scurvy. Fingers discolored, gums receding, eyes bleeding from within their sockets. By the time his vision blurred, he could no longer grip the hilt of his cutlass. The world tilted. He lay on the planks, every breath a ragged heave, sweat and seawater mingling in his hair. A single drop of blood fell from his nose, and the deck drank it greedily. But pirates, like all desperate souls, are stubborn. He learned, by bitter trial, to navigate this maelstrom of suffering. He clamped his teeth on a leather strap to steady himself against the lurching deck. He mastered a rolling gait that let him stagger to his post, despite shredded knee ligaments. He collected his wits at each gust of wind, mapping the sea's movement in his bones. And in those brief moments of clarity, when the sun broke through gray storms and he felt the heat on his scarred flesh, he tasted freedom. A freedom so narrow, so defined by filth and pain, that he would risk it all again. The rats, the dysentery, the sawbones blade, and the endless hunger. Because on land, he had nothing but despair. Here, in this rotting prison of wood and salt, he was alive. The cut of Captain Ironhand Delacroix's coat was impeccable. Even in the stench of sweat, salt, and gunpowder, he carried himself like a king. But kings fall fast at sea. It started with a whisper below decks. Jules, Two-Teeth Martin, the ship's quartermaster, cornered a half-drunk helmsman in the dim glow of a lantern. "He's stealing our shares," Jules hissed, pressing a bony finger into the man's chest. 5 gold coins per raid. Gone. The helmsman's eyes bulged. "You're mad, man. That's the captain's cut." Jules slipped into the shadows, his teeth catching the light in a cruel grin. Word spread like spilled gunpowder. The captain was pocketing more than his 100th share. Fear and greed, dangerous twins, coiled through the crew. Macro loop, number 1. The promise of fair shares. 2 voyages earlier, Delacroix had preached equality. Each man's share equals blood spilled. They had cheered, believing they'd escaped the land's elites. Now, that promise sagged under the weight of unreturned plunder. One moonless night, the crew gathered in the hold. No torches, only tallow candles held high on empty rum bottles. The quartermaster called the roll. Each man's name echoed against wood and bone. They voted by placing a chipped pewter coin into one of 2 makeshift chests. Keep Delacroix, or try Delacroix. Heartbeats thundered. The first 10 coins clattered into keep, then a dozen into try. By 30 votes, the chest for trial overflowed. A single candle sputtered, as if gasping at the verdict. The trial Delacroix sat on a barrel, arms bound, his iron hook resting on the deck like a fallen scepter. He pleaded, "I reinvest plunder into repairs, into us." But every man knew the true cost. Boarded merchant ships left adrift, rotting in distant currents. As his words faded, a cutthroat known as Black Marin stood. "He's right," she rasped. "Without a ship, we die drifted or drown." Murmurs rose. Some shook their heads. Others clenched wooden stakes. Yet the vote held. 14 for guilt, 12 for acquittal. A slim majority, sealed by trembling hands. Delacroix's blood steamed as they slit his bonds. Macro loop closure. They spared his life, but stripped him of status. Torn coat, burnt insignia, a single 1/10 share remained. It was justice, of a sort, brutal, and immediate. Betrayal in the ranks. In pirate life, loyalty was a brittle shell around a corrosive center of mistrust. The next morning, as dawn painted the sails pink, the furious captain of a passing sloop hailed them with cannon fire. An ambush. Who betrayed them? Instantly, suspicion ignited. The lookout, a wiry youth named Bram, admitted he'd sold their course for a cut. Half of his last 3 shares vanished. Under pressure, he confessed to meeting with the sloop's commander in a tavern ashore. The crew seethed. Some spat curses. Others eyed Bram's mother, held hostage in Port Ruthless. Under the law of pirates, hostages were leverage, and Bram was both traitor and victim. They convened again, this time in the open forecastle. "Kill him," shouted one. "Spare him," hissed another. The sea was calm, a mocking mirror. Bram knelt, forehead to deck, sobbing. "I loved this life, but I feared for her more." A vote. 13 to kill, 11 to spare. Bram was left chained to the capstan, rationed water and hardtack, his sobs a constant dissonance against the slap of waves. Pirate democracy, rising. The quartermaster, Jules, rode the momentum. "Enough of these ad hoc rulings," he declared. "We shall codify our laws." He hammered together a plank out of an old spar and carved 10 bullet-shaped notches, 1 notch per man. Above it, the words, "Equal share." Every sunrise for a week, they met in that open-deck circle. Proposals flew. 3 grog rations per man, no more. Vote each man's share at port, no captain's prerogative. Any man can challenge another's vote, trial by council. Each motion needed 2/3 majority. Tension built as men angled for advantage, whispered slurs, remembered old debts. Effect of Zygarnik. Each unresolved motion haunted the crew. They'd go below decks, hearts pounding, only to recall the rigging maintenance vote still pending. "We can't sail until it's settled," they'd mutter. The coup that never was. In the 6th meeting, a young bosun named Cora stood up. Petite but fierce, she demanded a motion to depose Jules as quartermaster, accusing him of steering votes to suit his favorites. The assembled slices of humanity tensed. Alliances would shatter here. 13 nods, 6 shakes of the head. The motion fell short. Jules gloated, victory perched on a slender ledge. Cora's eyes flicked to Marin, Bram, even Delacroix. She vowed silently she would return with a majority next time. Unexpected justice. Then came the haul they'd been dying for, a richly laden Spanish galleon. They boarded at dawn, steel clashing, muskets roaring. In the chaos, Marin coordinated a medical party for wounded under Bram's watch. Bram, shackled but determined, dodged splinters to drag men from the fray. After victory, Jules proposed punishing Bram for treason. "He still owes us." But the crew hesitated. Who had risked life to save them? Fingers turned. They recalled Bram's tears and his courage under fire. In an instant, the democratic code writ on splintered spar became more than carved wood. It was living justice. They voted, 11 to free Bram, 8 to keep him chained. Bram collapsed into Marin's arms, weeping for the first time in gratitude rather than fear. False security and the next wave. As the Scarlet Marauder sailed north, their shared triumph glowed like embers. Yet beneath the deck, new grudges festered. Cora's ambition, Delacroix's smoldering anger at his demotion, whispers that Bram's sister, held in Port Ruthless, might be sold again unless they returned to land. The cycle would repeat, a new motion, a fresh vote, another mutiny whisper, and each time they'd draw closer to the edge. because democracy at sea is a blade that cuts both friend and foe alike. Night swallowed the deck in hazy darkness. Elias leaned against the railing, his stump wrapped in blood-stained cloth, and watched phosphorescent waves blink beneath the hull. Death no longer terrified him. He had seen too much. Gangrene, the surgeon saw, scurvy blackened gums. It was nothing but an extension of the same machinery that had ground him down physically. What haunted him now was the void, an infinite pit of meaninglessness at the heart of every clasped fist and every broken oath. He remembered the moment the emptiness took hold, the dawn after the Spanish galleon raid. While others celebrated with stolen rum and stolen gold, he felt only hollow echo in his chest. The shouts of triumph grated like stones on stone. He had killed a man in the melee, pulled the trigger himself, and the body fell lifeless at his feet. But instead of adrenaline, he felt nothing. Not relief, not guilt, only the cold absence of feeling. He stared at the corpse until a rat crawled into its neck wound, and he turned away, hollow-eyed. Sleep became his refuge and his torture. On the third night after the raid, he dreamed of home. In the vision, sunlight streamed through a low cottage window. Morning dew glistened on barley fields. His mother stood in the doorway, her apron folded at her waist, hair tied back with a faded blue ribbon. She smiled, warmth radiating from her like an ember. He stumbled toward her, tears blurring his sight. "Mama," he whispered, voice cracking. She opened her arms. He felt the soft linen of her dress and the pulse of her heartbeat. Then the dream curdled. Her eyes turned void black. The ribbon snapped. The barley fields rattled into ash. He woke in a cold sweat, fingers twisted into splinters of stolen wood. That vision was a cipher, a bridge to something deeper than fear or despair. He realized that the life he'd fled, memories of plowed earth, of sunlight on his mother's cheek, had shaped him more than the salt and blood at sea. The sensations of childhood, the warmth of hearth smoke, the weightless dance of dust motes in a sunbeam were the compass he'd lost. In that dream vision, he rediscovered the map of his soul. Days later, the crew captured a lone traitor and prepared him for execution. Elias found himself beside the condemned man at the rail, armored in nothing but a rough shirt and regret. The prisoner's hands were tied. His eyes, wide with terror, found Elias's. In that gaze was a mirror, the same raw desperation, the same silent plea for mercy that Elias had once sent to his own mother. As the executioner lifted his blade, the man closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, invoking the name of God he barely knew. Elias paused. The air hung thick with the stench of salt and gore. He could feel every heartbeat on that windy deck, his and the prisoner's, pounding like furies. In the hush before the strike, he raised his own voice, trembling but clear. "Stop!" The executioner's axe froze mid-air. The crowd pressed in, eyes glinting with hunger for blood. Elias stepped forward, placing his stump between the blade and the man's neck. "Let him live," he said. "He's no better than I was. Lost, afraid. He deserves more than death." A ripple of dissent rolled through the crew. Some spat curses, others lowered their weapons. The traitor's wide eyes locked with Elias's, gratitude and disbelief ignited in his gaze. At that moment, Elias felt a surge of something he had not felt in months. Purpose. It was not the cheap thrill of victory, nor the evanescent relief of a bottle of rum. It was the weight of responsibility, the gravity of compassion. In the days that followed, Whispers spread across the ship. Elias had saved a life. That act, small as it seemed, cracked the damp walls around his heart. He sought solitude, wandering the deck at dawn. He began to speak prayers in the tongue of his mother's faith, fragmented phrases he remembered from childhood. May the Lord give you peace. May you find strength in forgiveness. Sometimes his words faltered into tears, sometimes into silence, but each prayer was a stone laid across the chasm of his emptiness. He discovered that hope could be kindled within the body as surely as despair. In the surgeon's bay, he tended to wounded comrades, bandaging slashes, rinsing gangrenous rot, murmuring gentle words into their ears. He recalled the hands that had once torn flesh from his socket and refused to return violence with violence. Instead, he pressed cool cloths to fevered brows, shared the last ration of hardtack with the starving. Each act of care built a bridge back to his own humanity. As weeks passed, Elias's dreams changed. The same cottage would appear, but this time his father joined. Weather-beaten, eyes proud, hands strong. He guided Elias into a field of swaying wheat, where the sun was a living presence, and birds sang without malice. His parents spoke in unison. You belong both to the field and the sea, to suffering and to mercy. Choose where you plant your seed. Then the vision faded into a golden haze rather than ash. Elias woke, sunlight warming his face, and for the first time in months, he smiled. He stood before the crew one evening, the sea calm as glass. Candles glowed around the deck like fallen stars. Men, he said, voice steady, we have taken many lives, broken many promises. But I still believe there is a purpose beyond plunder. We can choose to be more than rogues. We can carry mercy in our hands and honor in our hearts. A hush fell. Some scowled. Others bowed their heads. Then Jules, two teeth. Martin stepped forward and laid a hand on Elias's shoulder. I've seen your prayers in action, he said quietly. Let us follow where they lead. In that moment, the Scarlet Marauder became more than a ship. It became a vessel of rebirth. Each man lit a candle, carried it to the rail, and set it adrift. Tiny beacons flickering across the black water. Elias watched them drift and merge with the stars, a procession of hope born out of brutality. He knew the sea would not forgive easily, nor would their past disappear with a single act. Storms would come, betrayal would stalk their ranks, and death would still circle overhead. But Elias had been reborn in the crucible of his own soul. He no longer feared emptiness. He carried within him a spark of light that even the deepest abyss could not extinguish. And so he stood beneath the night sky, the wind whispering ancient psalms through the rigging, the candles dancing on the waves. In that fragile glow, Elias felt at last that he had found what he'd truly been seeking all along, a reason to live, to fight, and, when the time came, to face death not with resignation, but with gratitude for a life reclaimed. The dawn sky burned orange as Elias stood before the trembling prisoner, his stump wrapped in fresh cloth, his heart pounding like a war drum. On one side, the gleaming cutlass of the executioner. On the other, the faces of his crew, husbands, brothers, former farmers, and tailors, waiting for him to decide. Their eyes were hard, the promise of bloodlust flaming in their depths. He's a spy, snarled Black Marin, her voice like gravel. She spat at the man's feet. He gave our position away to that frigate. They almost boarded us last night. 20 good men lost their lives. The prisoner, a young sailor no older than Elias, knelt, chained to the capstan, head bowed. His shoulders shook with sobs. He looked up at Elias through tear-blurred eyes. "I had no choice," he rasped. "They threatened my sister. They said if I didn't guide them, they'd burn her alive." The words hit Elias like a cannonball. He remembered the ragged glance his own mother cast after he'd first left home, pleading for him not to go. Her dress frayed at the edges, hands wrung with worry. He saw that same anguish mirrored in this boy's gaze. But mercy would mean risking his men's lives. The frigate that hunted them was relentless. It had sunk 2 smaller sloops already. One more slip-up, and every soul aboard the Scarlet Marauder would drown or be hung as traitors. Rage seized him first, the bitterness of betrayal, the stench of dishonor. "He's a coward," Elias wanted to shout. "He sold us out. And for what? His sister?" He looked at the man's torn shirt, threadbare at the collar, and felt a surge of disgust at his own soft heart. Could he, should he, let one life override 20? He remembered the blade's cold kiss against his own flesh during his amputation. He remembered the surgeon's saw, the powerless scream he'd swallowed. He wondered if death might be mercy compared to fear. Yet just as swiftly, doubt cut through him. A whisper rising over the clamor of Black Marin's calls for blood. This boy is like me, another pawn in a larger game. Would they have killed me if they'd caught me on land? Across the deck, Jules Two-Teeth Martin shifted his weight. He'd voted 14 to spare Captain Delacroix, remembering what ruthless might cost them, and 12 to condemn Bram, torn between pity and wrath. Now his teeth glinted as he stared at the prisoner. Elias heard the quartermaster's low muttering to Marin, "The code is clear. Betrayer dies." The mood among the crew swayed like the ship itself. Some leaned in, fists clenched. Others hung back, jaw tight with unease. The sea hissed against the hull, a silent jury's verdict ready to be pronounced. Elias swallowed. He could feel the stench of sweat and salt in his lungs, his own and the prisoner's. He thought of his mother's gentle hands, the smell of barley fields after rain. He thought of the prayers he'd whispered, the candlelight flickering on water. Could he betray the spark of compassion within him, deny the same mercy that had saved the traitor? He pressed a hand to his chest, where his heartbeat thundered. Responsibility. Every crewmate's life weighed on him. He'd promised them leadership, loyalty, purpose. If he let sentiment override duty, he'd be as culpable as the captain who'd pocketed shares. Soft, unfit, and doomed to die under the gallows. The prisoner looked up again, hope mingling with terror. "Please," came the plea, soft as a cradle's lullaby. "I'll do anything, to make this right." Elias's jaw clenched. He recalled the dagger's promise at his own throat during his induction raid. Join us, or bleed. He'd chosen to bleed, to fight, to survive. Yet here was the boy, choosing the same for love of family. A moment stretched, longer than any storm-tossed watch. In that pregnant silence, the rhythm of the sea matched the drumming in his ears. He saw the executioner's blade, cold, inevitable. He saw the prisoner's tear-streaked face. He saw the crew, the flicker of their torches, the glint of steel. Finally, Elias spoke, voice low but steady. "Bring the barrel." A grunt, and the prisoner was marched to the stern, the deck creaking beneath him. They placed a wine barrel under his knees. 2 muskets' barrels pointed at his back, Black Marin's and the bosun Cora's. Elias took a deep breath. "Spare him," he commanded. "He will row the longboat until dawn, alone. Then I release him. If he survives, he may keep his life." A roar of protest rose instantly. He'll just spy again. He'll die out there. He's a traitor. He's a man. Elias cut through them, his stump raised like a banner of mercy. He's terrified. He may make mistakes, but he'll not kill for us again unless we let him. Spare him for his sister's sake, and ours. Black Marin glared, then spat into the ocean. Her musket lowered an inch. Jules studied the staves beneath his boots. One by one, the other's weapons fell silent. When the sun broke over the horizon, the crew rowed the prisoner out to sea in the longboat. Elias watched until the spray swallowed the last oar stroke. No cheers accompanied his decision, only the sigh of wind in the rigging and the steady slap of waves. For the first time since taking command, Elias felt the true weight of leadership. Not the sword's edge, but the choice to temper justice with mercy. He turned away as the longboat shrank to a black dot, unsure if he had saved a life or doomed countless others. But in the hollows of his chest, the void had grown smaller, a single candle flame battling the dark. And as the Scarlet Marauder set sail toward its next fate, Elias braced himself for the storm to come, knowing that the hardest battles are fought not with cutlasses, but within the human heart. The lanterns swung like pendulums as the Scarlet Marauder pitched on a rising swell. Below deck, a low murmur rippled through the cramped forecastle. Mutiny was afoot. Rumors that Captain Elias had shown mercy to the prisoner, released him to the mercy of the sea, had split the crew into factions. Whispers of weakness and betrayal dripped like candle grease onto wooden planks. Midnight spark. It began when Bram, now freed and restored to the deck, stumbled into the officers' mess hall, clutching a scrap of smuggled parchment. He'd found it hidden in the trader's belongings, a letter from the Admiralty, addressed to Captain Elias himself. In ink smeared by salt water, it congratulated him on capturing the frigate's informant and promised a pardon to any pirate who surrendered and delivered the ship's log. Bram's voice shook as he read aloud, "Stand down, or we will torch every mast in the harbor. Your lives for this ship, and your mercy will be judged at the hangman's gallows." The words scorched the air. Any pirate who surrendered would earn clemency and fame if the Admiralty saw fit. But for pirates, surrender meant the death of their way of life and the end of their stolen democracy. Loyalists versus realists. A faction immediately crystallized. Half the crew, led by Black Marin, favored defiance. "We bleed for this ship. We choose our own fate." They sharpened cutlasses in the lantern light, eyes silvered with righteous fury. The other half, led by Cora and some grizzled old salts, argued pragmatism. Better our hides than a wooden hulk on the bottom. They eyed the powder stores as though preparing for a desperate gambit. Elias paced on the quarterdeck. Bram's parchment burned in his hand, and the soft glow of dawn had not yet chased away the dread. Was it a trap? A clever piece of propaganda meant to fracture them before the Navy struck? Or truth? If the Admiralty truly offered mercy, then turning in the mariner's pride, the ship they had taken mere weeks before might spare dozens of lives. But loyalty ran deeper than self-preservation. It was written in salt and spilled blood. The council. Before the rising sun, Elias called a council at the capstan. Lanterns were brought up, each man depositing a pewter tally coin into one of two chests. Fight on, or surrender and live. Voices trembled as they spoke, some in whispers, some in shouted defiance. Black Marin banged her blade on a keg. "I vote to fight. Better to die free than live in chains." Jules Two-Teeth Martin held up a scorched tobacco pipe. I've seen better sense in a landlubber. No vote for me. A veteran named Silas, one eye replaced by a glass globe, rasped, "The Admiralty lies. Their mercy is a noose." But even Silas's vote wavered. He remembered his own narrow escape from a gallows 20 years past. A crack in the hull. As the votes were tallied, a distant boom ripped through the dawn. The lookout on the mizzenmast shouted, "Sloop closing fast on the starboard bow." In minutes, the stranger's silhouette resolved into a naval warship, black flags snapping in the wind. Their artillery bristled like metal porcupine quills. On deck, Marin roared for guns to be loaded. Cora barked for a quartermaster to ready the surrender flag. Paranoia crackled through the air. Was the Navy here to honor the pardon, or to trap them in open water with no escape? Each man's heartbeat hammered against his ribs, echoing the drums of war. Elias's choice. He stood at the center of the deck, the parchment in one hand, his stump clenched in the other. Sailors clustered around him, eyes wide. Elias saw the stakes writ plainly on their faces: unity or disintegration, life or death. A single misstep would splinter their fragile democracy forever. "Listen," Elias's voice cut through the clamor like a flare. "They want to divide us. If we lower our colors, we may survive. But we will be the Admiralty's puppets. If we fire, we risk annihilation. But we are pirates, children of chaos and free will. We make our own fate." Marin raised her cutlass, face ablaze. "To hell with mercy." Or, Cora countered, voice trembling, "We strike no colors, but we don't fire on the yacht. We sail past, unchallenged, if they truly honor the pardon." The blood moon maneuver. Elias inhaled the salt air, tasting fear and resolve. He recalled the prayer he'd whispered to spare the prisoner. He sensed the same spark of compassion flicker in Cora's eyes, and yet he felt Marin's fury as though it were his own pulse. He raised his stump high, calling for silence. "We sail between them," he commanded. "No guns. We show them our ship's hull, blood red under the morning sun. If they fire on us, we fight back. If they do not, we sail free. Agreed?" A tense hush fell. Then Marin spat at the deck and nodded. Cora wiped a tear from her cheek and squared her shoulders. Bram swallowed hard and dropped his last tally coin into the fight-on chest. By his vote, a tie. Collision course. The Scarlet Marauder bore down on the warship's port side, sails taut. Cannons trained on her, crew braced on the gunwales. Elias could smell the fresh pitch, the wet ropes, and closer still, oil for the naval ship's guns. The warship's captain shouted orders in clipped tones, but his message carried in the wind. "Call off your crew and surrender the vessel, or we will send you to Davy Jones's locker." Elias glanced at his men. Some hands trembled on the rigging. Some knuckles whitened on cutlass hilts. In that moment, he knew that unity was not mere agreement. It was trust forged in fire. He raised his hand in salute to the warship's captain and shouted, "We sail free or die free." No quarter given or asked. The aftermath. No shots rang out. The warship's captain, perhaps awed or uncertain, lowered his hand. The flagship cut her engines and her sails furled. "You have your pardon, this time," came the voice from across the deck. A collective exhale rolled through Elias's crew. Cora wept softly. Marin cracked a grin and threw an arm around Silas. Elias allowed himself a single breath of relief, unity preserved by razor's edge. But as the two ships separated, each man carried a shard of doubt. Had they gambled too much? Was the Admiralty's mercy genuine, or would they be hunted anew? Paranoia lingered, like the odor of gunpowder in the air, a reminder that in the world of pirates, every advantage could vanish with the rising tide. Elias watched the warship's silhouette fade into the horizon. His choice had held, but the next wave was already building, and this fragile unity would be tested again. Until then, they sailed on, bound together by a single, burning truth. Loyalty, once fractured, is never easily mended. The wind fell away as dawn's gray light revealed the looming shapes on the horizon, a line of warships stretching across the sea like iron leviathans. Their black hulls bristled with dozens of cannon ports, flags snapping with imperial authority. The Scarlet Marauder trembled on the swell, every plank and rope vibrating with tension. Captain Elias stood at the helm, stump gripping the wheel, eyes locked on the nearest galleon. Its 3 decks of guns promised a fury that could shatter wood and bone alike. He recalled the freedom he'd tasted, narrow and bitter as it was, and knew that here, under the guns of an empire, freedom itself would be on trial. The Imperial Armada Admiral Vincenzo di Santoro commanded the fleet. His flagship, the Regina Vittoria, rode at the center, sails taut and masts crowned with gilded ornaments. In the admiral's cabin, maps were unrolled and plotted, every pirate haunt marked for eradication. To Santoro, pirates were vermin to be excised, their democracy a cancer on the seas. Now he had his chance. At sunrise, the admiral's voice boomed over the water. "Lay down your arms, pirate dogs. Submit your ship, or be sunk where you float." His flagship's cannons thundered in warning, booming volleys that tore the morning calm, sending waves crashing over the Marauder's deck. Decision point. Elias felt the first real taste of fear since the dysentery weeks ago. This was no single sloop or sneeze of shot. It was the concentrated might of empire, trained on him and every man at his back. If he surrendered, he'd be tried, hung, then forgotten. If he fought, every broadside could send his crew to Davy Jones's locker. His crew scrambled to their stations. Black Marin and Cora loaded powder into the ship's 4 cannons, insufficient to match the galleon's dozen, but enough to send Imperial timbers splintering if aimed true. The quarterdeck crew fetched chain shot for rigging, hoping to cripple sails rather than kill. They were pirates, but they knew that victory came from cunning, not brute force alone. Opening salvo. The Regina Vittoria fired first, a full broadside of heavy iron balls that screamed across the void. One slammed into the Marauder's aft, shearing off the wheel's replica and sending wood chips flying. Elias yanked the wheel on its axle, spinning the ship in a high arc. The Marauder shuddered under the blast. A shivered plank tore a jagged wound along the side. Marin's shot answered. A chain ball struck the galleon's rigging, severing a shroud and sending the mainsail drooping like a wounded bird. Cheers erupted, but only for a moment. Another volley from Santoro's flagship slammed into the Marauder's forecastle, snapping timbers and sending 3 men, a gunner and 2 deckhands, tumbling into the brine. Their screams, cut short by water, echoed in Elias's ears. Heroic sacrifice. Cora rushed forward, wrenching powder horns from their hooks and charging toward the powder magazine. A stray shot ruptured the barrels, flames licking the hatch. Cora slammed it shut, just as sparks ignited the loose gunpowder. She knelt at the hatch, with her blood, bright as fresh coral, mopping the embers and preventing an explosion that would have shattered the ship's belly. As smoke curled around her limp form, Elias caught her eye. Her sacrifice had saved them from instant destruction. Desperate maneuvers. Elias ordered a daring tactic, Full helm, hard starboard, brace for grape shot. The marauder answered the helm and turned broadside to the Regina Vittoria, exposing her own side, but placing her 4 cannons at their closest range. Each gun crew braced themselves, igniting fuses. The concussion rattled every tooth in Elias's skull, but the shot tore into the galleon's lower deck. A volley of screams rose as Imperial Marines fell, but the price was steep. A second Imperial broadside struck the marauder's hull amidships, splintering wood, rupturing the hold. Water rushed in, and the ship listed. Elias staggered, then recovered. "Lower the starboard panel, flood the bilge pumps." The crew fought against the tide of water, forming human chains to bail out the brine. Turn of the tide. Despite their valor, the pirates were outgunned. The Regina Vittoria prepared to deliver the coup de grace. Elias, seeing the fatal arc of the next broadside, made a fateful command. "All hands, prepare to board." Muskets cracked in defiance as pirates scrambled up the weathered rope ladders toward the galleon's deck. Elias led the charge, stump swinging a boarding pike. On the galleon's deck, Imperial sailors formed ranks. Swords flashed, muskets roared. The clash was brutal and personal, each pirate fighting for every inch. Elias cut down a Marine, then another. Blood sprayed the deck like cruel rain. He saw the Admiral's banner, gilded eagle on crimson field, and lunged for it. Admiral Santoro met him with a rapier's thrust, but Elias parried, wounded Santoro in the arm, and tore down the banner's halyard. The eagle fluttered free, drifting over the sea. Tragic cost. For a moment, the boarding succeeded. The Regina Vittoria's crew reeled in confusion. The pirates cheered, and Cora, bleeding but alive, rallied them forward. But from the lower deck, fresh Marines poured up the companionway, bayonets gleaming. The tide turned. Marin's final act was to throw herself before Elias, taking a musket ball meant for him. She fell, eyes bright with defiance. Elias cradled her, but the sea claimed her quickly, her blood seeping through his fingers into the wood. Realizing the slaughter would never end, Elias called retreat. "Fall back to the longboats. Save yourselves." They flooded down the nets, wounded and exhausted, as Imperial muskets spat fire. Elias was the last off the deck. He leapt into a waiting boat just as the marauder lurched. There, a final broadside blasted her stern, setting her ablaze. Aftermath on the water. In the longboats, rowers strained against the oarlocks. Flames licked the pirate ship's timbers, shadows dancing on their blood-streaked faces. Cora lay broken. Black Marin was gone, and dozens more lay dead or dying. Elias sat at the bow, clutching the Imperial banner he had torn down, tears carving tracks through salt and soot. Behind them, the Imperial squadron did not pursue. Santoro, nursing a wounded arm, watched his flagship burn the Scarlet Marauder to cinders. He understood that sometimes victory at such cost feels hollow. The end of an era. As dawn turned to morning, survivors drifted toward a distant island. Their numbers were small now, barely a quarter of their original crew. They had escaped destruction, but at the price of every dream they'd ever held. The Scarlet Marauder was ash upon the sea, freedom consumed in flame. Silence settled over the longboats, broken only by ragged breaths. Elias raised the torn banner, letting it unfurl in the breeze. "We live," he whispered, voice trembling with grief and awe. But at what cost? They had fought an empire and paid a tragic price. Their legend would be told in taverns and courts, but the cost would never be measured in gold. It would be tallied in lost lives, broken bodies, and a freedom extinguished by superior force. And as the survivors pulled toward the shore, each man carried inside him the weight of that day, the terror, the heroism, the tragedy, knowing that history would remember only the battle, never the souls forever altered by its fire. The morning sunlight slanted across the shore, turning drifts of seaweed into bronze ribbons. Elias sat on a charred plank, the torn imperial banner laid across his lap like a funeral shroud. Around him, ragged survivors began the grim business of gathering wood and fresh water. He watched them, once boisterous, now silent, each man a broken testament to a dream's cost. He looked at his stump, wrapped in a soiled rag, and felt a curious absence. It wasn't the loss of flesh or the fear of death that haunted him now. It was the yawning void inside his chest, the same void he had starved against with bullets, blade-wielding surgeons, and countless nights of delirium. He had thought freedom lay in the cut of a sail or the flash of plundered gold. But gold had never filled that empty place. It only tinkled hollow. Deep sadness. He recalled the first time he'd lifted a bar of Spanish silver, fingers slick with his own blood, and felt nothing but a cold recoil. He'd imagined that treasure would heal the ache of insignificance. Instead, each coin felt like salt ground into a wound. He remembered the farmer's daughter he once courted, Teresa, her laughter bright as sunlight on barley. He'd left her a promise of return, a ring of twisted wire. She kept it pinned inside her bodice for years, but he never came back. The emptiness had grown with every kill. He could still see the traitor's face, the boy spy's tears, Marin's dying eyes outside the galleon's porthole. Each sacrifice, each ruthless choice, had been made under the banner of freedom. Yet freedom, he realized, was only as real as the reasons for which you lived. Moment of insight. That evening, Elias walked to the water's edge. The tide gurgled around his feet, scouring away footprints. He knelt and drew a swirl in the wet sand, a crude circle. Inside, he traced a dot, then another. He whispered to the sea, "Point and line only matter when you connect them." He thought of his life as a series of unconnected points. Famine in his village, first gunpowder burn, fevered delirium, the razor's edge of battle, the silent promise betrayed by every coin. But there had never been a line, no true purpose. A feather washed ashore, white, trimmed with ocean salt. He picked it up, fingertips trembling, and held it against his chest. Its softness contrasted with the brittle wood of the plank beneath him. In that touch, he felt a spark. The world was not just the sharp taste of blood or the sting of the surgeon's saw. It was also moments of grace, the traitor's prayer before execution, the shared murmur of hope in Bram's vote, Cora's sacrifice to save the magazine's flame. Emerging clarity. Elias rose and faced the wreckage of camp. The crew had built a small fire. They sat around it, soaked and weary. Each man looked at him when he approached, silently asking, "What now?" He spoke without looking away from the flames. "We sought gold, adventure, freedom. But I see now that none of those fill the empty places within us. We fled from the land's injustice, but we carried the same emptiness here." He paused, feeling the weight of every gaze. "I don't know what awaits us on that island beyond the dunes, but I do know this. We can choose to fill the void with something more than blood and coin. We can choose to be more than shadows of ourselves." Some faces softened, tears catching the firelight. Others remained guarded, but none looked away. A new commitment. He stepped closer to the fire, placing the feather atop a small driftwood stake. "Let this be our symbol," he said. "A feather, light, fragile, but carried by the wind. We will follow where it leads, not for gold, but for meaning. We will heal one another's wounds, share our stories, and build something that lasts beyond a ledger of plunder." Black Marin, her face streaked with soot, nodded. She took a flint and sparked the feather's edge. Its flame was tiny, but it burned bright. She offered it to Elias, who held it before his heart. The feather flared up, crisping into ash that drifted into the air. Then each man took the charred remains and cast them into the flames. The fire kindled, roaring to life. It leapt higher, purifying their battered emotions. Resolution. Elias felt the hollow in his chest shift, no longer an endless pit, but a space waiting to be filled, not by gold or violence, but by compassion, purpose, and the shared humanity of his crew. He looked at the horizon, blue, unbroken. The island beyond beckoned. He turned to his men. "Tomorrow, we rebuild. We plant gardens. We share what we have. We remember those we've lost, and we honor them by living lives of meaning." A murmur of agreement rose. They clasped arms, forming a circle around the fire. Elias closed his eyes as the flames warmed his face. He inhaled the smoke's sweet tang and felt, for the first time in years, the solid line connecting the points of his life back to Teresa's laughter and forward to a new dawn. In the crackle of embers, he made a vow to live so that the void would never swallow him again, and to guide his crew from the shadows into light. He opened his eyes. His heart still bore scars, but the emptiness was gone. In its place glowed a single, unquenchable ember of faith in what it meant to be truly alive. Elias crept below decks, torch in hand, toward the surgeon's bay, where the bodies of the fallen were stacked in canvas slings. He'd heard rumors. Bram's journal, torn between the bodies of Black Marin and Cora, lay hidden among their effects. He paused at the hatch, heart pounding. This was more than curiosity. Something primal tugged him forward. He knelt beside Marin's sling first, brushing back her tangled hair. Then he found Cora's bundle, and finally, Bram's. The journal was bound in oilskin, edges frayed and wax-sealed. He cracked it open to the first page. The neat looping handwriting belonged to a boy, no older than 16. Elias's throat tightened as he read, "I am Bram, once a field slave on the sugar plantations of Saint Clement. They called me property, number 427. When I heard of the pirates, I saw a chance for freedom. Not gold, not glory, just an end to being owned. I sold my blood for a cut of shares I never truly wanted. I wanted air in my lungs, choice in my steps." Shock bloomed in Elias's chest. All this time, he had assumed Bram's betrayal had been simple treachery. He saw now that Bram had gambled everything for a chance at life, just as Elias himself had. He read on. "When I joined the Scarlet Marauder, I thought I was buying happiness. But the ledger of plunder only records coin, never the cost in souls. Tonight I saw the prisoner's face, my own face staring back. I understand now, the emptiness I carried was not mine alone. If I live, I will plant a seed of mercy even in these cursed decks." Elias pressed a hand against the page, the words burning like acid. A meta-hook clicked into place. The promise of pirate freedom, which he had once drunk like rum, was revealed as a romantic lie. Freedom meant only a fleeting taste, always followed by blood and betrayal. He slid the journal into his coat and emerged into the moonlit deck. Around him, the crew slept in ragged clusters, hammocks swinging above the wet wood. He climbed to the quarterdeck, where the wind carried the distant toll of church bells from the island chapel. His mind raced. The next dawn would bring the young slave still chained in the longboat, destined for the auction block, unless he intervened. Below, the officer's cabin door stood ajar. He slipped inside to find Black Marin's old cutlass propped against the bulkhead. He lifted it reverently, its edge dulled by battle. Then he moved to the lockbox where the ship's orders were kept. Using a stolen key, he retrieved the Admiralty's mandate: deliver the youth to Port Ruthless. He is property of Her Majesty's crown. The paper crackled in his hands like a verdict. Elias's jaw clenched. To obey would be to consign a sentient child to chains, just as Bram had fled those same chains. To defy the order would mean open mutiny. Black Marin was dead, Cora too, and the crew had rallied under the banner of survival, not conscience. Elias felt the creak of fate shifting beneath his feet. He marched to the rail where the longboat hung, lanterns swaying over the gunwale. Below, the young slave huddled, eyes hollow under a stained linen hood. The moonlight revealed slender shoulders bound by iron and rope. Elias's throat ached at the sight. "Row up," he commanded the boatswain who stood guard. The boatswain hesitated, duty in his eyes. But at Elias's nod, he cut the rope. The boat dropped. Elias leapt in, cutlass heavy at his side, and settled beside the youth. "Name?" Elias said softly. "Samuel," the boy whispered, voice trembling as he lowered the hood. "Samuel," Elias repeated, "you are under my protection." The other pirates crowded the rail above. Elias stood and held up the journal. "Read this," he called. "This slave once bled for the same dream of freedom that we all chase. He is no prize to be sold. He is a human being, like you and me." A chorus of curses met him. "We need the gold," one cried. "We can't feed a mouth we didn't plan for." Another spat. Elias raised the sword. "I risk my life, and my command, to save him. If any man strikes here, you strike at me." His voice echoed across the water, steady as a bell. Silence fell. The only sound was the tide lapping at the longboat's hull. Elias opened Bram's journal to the final entry. "I dream of planting seeds in a field I own, of teaching children the barley's song. If I fail, know I died, trying to reclaim my life. May mercy be your compass." Tears blurred Elias's vision. "Mercy must be our compass," he whispered. He cut the boy's bonds with the sword's tip. The iron clinked into the bottom of the boat. Samuel rubbed his wrists, then raised his eyes, wide with shock, relief, and a fragile hope. Above, the crew whispered among themselves. Elias climbed back to the deck. "I call a vote," he announced. "Do we sail on, obeying the crown and selling this boy, or do we defy orders and carry his life as our true treasure?" Pewter coins clinked as each man cast his vote. Elias held his breath. The tally fell. 15 for mercy, 10 for obedience. A narrow margin, but enough. The crew shifted, some ashamed, others resolute. Cora's sacrifice and Bram's confession had carved a new reality. Pirates could choose compassion over cruelty. Elias's emotions roared, catharsis sweeping through him like a gale. The original siren song of pirate life, the promise of riches and freedom, was finally unmasked, a trap of isolation, emptiness, and moral betrayal. Here, at this moment, in the defiance of a crown's decree, the true treasure emerged, empathy's hard-won victory. He turned to Samuel. "Welcome to the Scarlet Marauder. You will eat from our rations, sleep in our hammocks, and choose your path. Samuel nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. The lantern light caught in his eyes like dawn. Elias sheathed the cutlass and extended his hand. "Come on board." As Samuel climbed up, the crew lowered the sails. The pirate flag fluttered above, no longer a banner of plunder alone, but a symbol of lives reclaimed. And as the Scarlet Marauder cut through the black water, its captain held Bram's journal to his heart, knowing that the revelation of one man's flight from bondage had transformed their course, and perhaps reshaped the very meaning of pirate freedom. The dawn sky was a bruised purple when Captain Elias gave the signal, "All hands to battle stations." The Scarlet Marauder's decks thrummed with the staccato of fuses being lit and muskets being rammed home. Smoke curled from the open gun ports. The scent of pitch and gunpowder saturated every breath. Elias stood at the bow, his stump wrapped in fresh cloth, his good hand gripping the boarding pike as though it were a talisman. Beyond the rigging lay the enemy ship, the HMS Vigilant, a sturdy frigate bristling with men and guns. Intelligence had reported her reinforcing the blockade to choke pirate channels. To defeat her meant crippling the Navy's chokehold, at the cost of almost certain death. "Fire!" Elias's voice carried above the roar of crackling fuses. The Marauder's 4 battered cannons thundered, each recoil jolting the ship's timbers underfoot. Iron shot screamed across the gap and bit into the Vigilant's hull. A pall of smoke drifted between the vessels, and the Vigilant replied in kind. A hail of grape shot shredding the air, splintering rails and sending 3 gun crews to the deck with fractured limbs. Elias dropped to one knee as a spray of metal whistled past his head. He gritted his teeth and rose, adrenaline sharpening his focus. "Boarding party! To the starboard nets!" The sailors, battle-worn men and boys who had survived storm and scurvy, answered with a guttural cheer. They clambered to the shrouds, boots finding purchase on wet rope ladders as the 2 ships ground together with a shudder like colliding giants. At the rail, Elias grabbed the grappling hook and swung it high. It caught the Vigilant's bulwark with a clang. He vaulted across, his pike at the ready, as the first of his crew surged over. The clash was immediate, a tangle of cutlasses, pikes, and pistols amidst the heavy spray of salt water. Below him, Black Marin's pike found purchase between an officer's ribs. She wrenched it free, eyes alight with feral determination. Cora, though bloodied and weakened from previous battles, stood beside Elias, blade in hand, deflecting a Marine's saber. "Hold the line," she shouted, adrenaline sparking courage in every chest. Elias pressed forward into the fray. His heart pounded in time with the chaotic symphony of steel on steel. He parried a thrust, then lunged, driving his pike through the shoulder plate of a Marine lieutenant. The man collapsed with a strangled cry. Elias wrenched the pike free and pointed to the deck below. "Push them back. Secure the quarterdeck." A wave of pirates poured across the deck. They knocked over canister crates, upended a swivel gun, and advanced under the Vigilant's ensign. Once a symbol of oppressive rule, now an emblem to be torn down. Elias leapt down into the cramped fighting space by the helm. The Vigilant's quartermaster, pistol in hand, spun to face him. Their eyes locked, a duel of will before the first shot rang out. Elias sidestepped the lieutenant's flintlock pistol blast. Smoke and sparks stung his cheek and closed the distance. He struck the lieutenant's wrist with the butt of his pike, snapping bone. The pistol clattered to the deck, and both men drew cutlasses. Elias's blade caught the moonlight as he blocked a vicious slash aimed at his throat. He drove forward, planting the flat of his blade against the lieutenant's breastplate. chest to chest. The lieutenant's face contorted as Elias squeezed mightily. Rust and salt flaked from the metal. With a final groan, the lieutenant slumped, and Elias stepped over the body onto the helm platform. Atop, he grasped the broken wheel and turned it, bringing the Vigilant's helm under pirate control. "We have her," he roared, voice thick with triumph. The Scarlet Marauder's ensign was raised, ripping the British colors free. The pirate flag unfurled in the morning breeze. But victory's joy was fleeting. A sudden explosion ripped through the Vigilant's magazine hold, an Imperial booby trap. Flames roared skyward, red and gold, and concussive shock waves rocketed through the decks. Sailors screamed as fire caught ropes and sails. The ship began to heel violently. "Fall back!" Elias bellowed, adrenaline and panic intermingling. "To the longboats, now!" He turned just as a section of charred deck collapsed behind him. Smoke choked his lungs. Hot embers stung his eyes. He staggered forward, cutting down a Marine who lunged with a bayonet, then hoisted the injured quartermaster, broken arm and leg, over his shoulder. Each step felt as though he carried the world's weight. Below deck, explosions rolled like thunder. Black Marin's shout echoed through the inferno, calling for survivors. Elias followed her voice and found her aiding wounded pirates, pressing cloth to burned flesh, dragging them toward the hatch. Her mask of ferocity had melted into fierce compassion. "Elias," she rasped, one hand clawing at his sleeve. "The magazines. We must get them clear before the whole ship goes up." He set the quartermaster down. "Lead them. I'll bring up the rest." He raced toward the hold entrance. Bodies and debris littered the walkway. The heat intensified with every step. A second fireball burst from the hold, and Elias was thrown against the bulkhead. His head smacked wood. Stars blossomed behind his eyes. He groaned and pushed himself upright. No time to bleed out. He pressed on, smoke stinging every breath. At the magazine door, he found the bosun wedged under a fallen spar. Elias heaved the spar aside and pried the door open. Inside, barrels of powder lined the walls, each a potential bomb. He and Cora, who had followed, dragged the barrels onto the deck, coughing as black smoke swirled around them. "Keep moving," Elias choked, slinging another barrel. His lungs felt like they'd catch fire. Behind him, a final blast knocked them both flat. Cora's head lolled at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled beneath her skull. Elias crawled to her, lifting her chin. Her eyes fluttered open, still lucid. She managed a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He pressed her head to his chest. "Rest," he said, tears mingling with soot. "Your sacrifice saved us all." Her hand slipped from his, and Elias wrapped the body in a tattered blanket. He rose, grief and rage coalescing into resolve. He pocketed the Vigilance quartermaster's badge, proof of conquest, and turned away. Outside, the Marauders' longboats waited. The survivors herded into them, wounded and weary. Elias climbed into the stern boat, the weight of command heavy on his broad shoulders. As he set to the oars, he looked back at the Vigilant, now a blazing hulk. Black smoke curled into the sky like a dark exclamation. One by one, they pushed off. The longboat skimmed across oil-slick water. Elias paused his rowing to help a crippled sailor into the stern. Each life he saved felt like redemption for every life he'd once taken. Heroism had a cost, and today he paid it in blood and broken bodies. When they drew far enough, Elias sat back on his oar, muscles trembling. Sunlight broke through the smoke. gilding the horizon in gold. The Scarlet Marauder's flag flew high on the Vigilant's mast, a testament that even in apparent defeat, pirate defiance could prevail. He closed his eyes and took a shuddering breath. Forgiveness washed through him. Not divine pardon, but the forgiveness of his own shattered conscience. Each rescued man, each saved soul, was a balm to his tormented spirit. The sea rocked them gently as the longboats cleared the smoking wreck. Elias looked at his crew, faces streaked with soot and tears, but alive. He raised a trembling hand. "To life," he whispered. And in that fragile moment of triumph, born from utter peril, each man knew that their freedom had been forged in the crucible of sacrifice, and that their captain, scarred and broken as he was, had led them to a victory that transcended gold and glory. Samuel dipped his quill into the inkpot, the feather trembling slightly in his calloused fingers. Around him, the survivors of the Scarlet Marauder gathered in the small, timbered hall they had built on the windswept shore. Lanterns cast a warm glow on weathered faces, Elias's among them, each man and woman a living testament to trials endured. He straightened a parchment on his lap and inhaled the salty air, steadying his voice. Though he was young, his eyes held an ancient calm, earned in the crucible of the sea. "My name is Samuel," he began, "and I am more than the chains I once wore." A hush settled as he continued, his tone gentle but unwavering. "When Captain Elias plunged into darkness to cut my bonds, he did more than save one life. He gave each of us a mirror to our own humanity." Soft glimmers of tears caught the lamplight as Samuel paused to gather his thoughts. "In the beginning," he said, "we set sail to steal gold, to carve our names into legend. We thought freedom lay in the glint of coin, in the roar of cannon fire. But freedom is not measured in plunder. It is measured in the choices we make when no one is watching." He looked toward Elias, whose stump rested on his knee, scar tissue pulsing with silent resolve. Captain Elias chose mercy. In that single act, he rewrote our story. He showed us that compassion is the greatest treasure, more lasting than any doubloon. Samuel rose and stepped closer to the hearth, where embers glowed like distant stars. "I have taken up this pen to bear witness. Witness to the screams in the forecastle, to the stench of gangrene, to the thunder of battle that shook our souls, but also witness to the laughter of reclaimed hope, to the prayer whispered in pitch-dark hold, to the hand that reached out in kindness when everything else burned." He brushed his fingers across the wooden table, leaving ink smudges like constellations of memory. "Let it be known that pirates are not simply villains of the seas. We are dreamers cast adrift, fallen lords who learned that our greatest triumphs were not achieved by violence, but by the courage to forgive." Samuel returned to his seat and dipped his quill carefully. "I will record every storm we weathered, every friend we lost, every choice that led us here. For future generations, if there are any, let them read and understand that the heart of a pirate is no different from yours. We bleed the same, we fear the same, we yearn for meaning." A soft breeze rattled the shutters, as if nature itself acknowledged his words. Samuel sealed the parchment and lifted it before the gathered crew. "This is our testament, not of gold plundered, but of lives reclaimed. May it remind us, on days when the horizon is obscured by doubt, that we chose light over darkness, mercy over cruelty, and humanity over hatred." He stepped back, lowering his gaze. Then, in a voice now hushed and reverent, Samuel offered the final monologue. an echo of philosophical closure that would carry beyond these walls. The sea does not forget. It holds every secret, every sorrow, every triumph within its endless expanse. We came to it seeking fortune, but found something deeper. The realization that every soul, no matter how battered, contains a spark of grace. In mercy, we found purpose. In compassion, we discovered strength. And in the bonds we forged with one another, we became something greater than a band of outlaws. We became a family. So let the waves carry our story far and wide, that those who listen may learn that true freedom is not the absence of chains, but the presence of love. And as long as one among us remembers this truth, the spirit of the Scarlet Marauder will live on, in ink, in song, and in the beating hearts of all who dare to forgive. He rolled the parchment, tying it with a scrap of sailcloth, and placed it in a small wooden chest. As Elias approached to place a hand on his shoulder, Samuel looked up and offered a serene smile. Around them, the crew rose, clasping arms in solidarity. The fire crackled, and beyond the window, the dark sea stretched to an infinite horizon, an open invitation to new beginnings. In that tranquil glow, Samuel's words hung like a benediction, a promise that even on the darkest seas, the light of mercy would guide them home. In the end, we stand at the edge of meaning, peering into the chasm that yawns between survival and humanity. Having witnessed the rawest forms of suffering and the heights of compassion, we must ask ourselves, what truly makes us human when all else is stripped away? What makes a person human in the face of degradation? Is it the capacity to feel pain? Every man aboard the Scarlet Marauder could testify to the agony of gangrene, hunger, and bone-splintering blows. Yet agony alone does not ennoble. It merely exposes our vulnerability. What elevates us is the choice the moment pain demands callousness or care. Elias tended wounds without promise of reward. Samuel chronicled truth rather than legend. In those acts, we see that empathy, reaching across the void to another's suffering, is the hallmark of our shared humanity, even amid degradation. Is freedom possible without violence? Freedom has long been equated with the crack of a pistol or the hiss of cutlasses on steel. But on these decks, freedom revealed itself in far subtler ways. Bram's trembling vote to spare a life, Cora's single act of mercy, Elias's refusal to betray his own conscience. Violence granted only fleeting autonomy. Compassion opened a space where true choice could flourish. Perhaps freedom without violence is not the absence of force, but the consistent refusal to let force define our choices. Is survival worth the loss of our humanity? Each day at sea posed that brutal question: would you kill to live another dawn? The ledger of survival tallied bodies like cargo, useful until they spoiled the hold. Yet every soul spared, every ounce of mercy given, was a deposit in the bank of one's own integrity. To survive unmoored from conscience is to drift without anchor, alive but hollow. The Scarlet Marauder taught that it is better to die bearing the weight of compassion than to live bearing the burden of cruelty. Why do we romanticize history's darkest corners? History's villains and outcasts beckon our imagination. The pirate's black flag, the outlaw's gleaming blade. We romanticize these extremes because they promise clarity of purpose, good or evil, hero or monster. Yet the truth is never so simple. The pirate's life, when lived, proved bitter, tragic, and infinitely complex. Our romantic myths are but mirrors, reflecting our darkest yearnings and brightest hopes. in embracing the full measure of their stories, the hunger, the sorrow, the flickers of mercy. We reclaim our own complexity, refusing to settle for caricature. In the end, the voyage of the Scarlet Marauder shows us that true transformation lies not in the killing of enemies, but in the saving of souls, including our own. When the cut of the blade yields to the touch of a healing hand, we cross the threshold from survival to significance. And though the waves may crash and the storms may howl, the light we carry within, of conscience, of compassion, of shared humanity, will be the compass that guides us home.